The glass fell from his hand before he could stop it. It struck the marble floor and shattered not with a bang, but with a clean, precise crack that cut through the silence of 400 people holding their breath. Ethan Caldwell stood perfectly still in the center of the ballroom, his fingers still curved around the shape of something that was no longer there, his face drained of the polished composure that had taken him decades to construct. And the woman standing 3 feet away from him did not move, did not flinch, did not look at the glass. She kept her eyes on him, steady, dark, and older than her age, because she had waited years for this exact moment, and she intended to be fully present inside it. The Meridian Grand Hotel occupied the top 4 floors of the tallest building in the city, and on the night of the Caldwell Foundation's annual charity gala, those floors were lit from within, like a lantern suspended above everything ordinary. $600,000 in floral arrangements, 12 chandeliers, each one imported from a glassworks in Vienna, waitstaff in white gloves who had been trained to pour wine without a sound. The kind of event where the cost of a single table setting exceeded the monthly rent of most of the people who would later read about it in the morning papers. The guests moved through the space the way wealth has always moved through space, slowly, with the quiet certainty of those who have never once had to wonder whether they belonged somewhere. She did not move that way. Naomi Reeves arrived alone, without an escort, without the small protective cloud of assistants and publicists that most guests at this level brought with them as a matter of course. She wore a deep navy dress, clean-lined and unadorned, and her posture was the kind that cannot be bought or practiced. It was simply the posture of a person who had survived things that would have ended someone else. The hostess at the entrance checked her invitation twice. A security man in an earpiece watched her cross the lobby. 2 women near the champagne tower glanced at her, and then at each other, with the particular economy of expression shared by people who have made a decision about someone they've never met. None of it touched her. She accepted a glass of water from a passing tray, moved to a position near the far edge of the room where she could see the entirety of the space, and she waited. Word moved through the room the way it always does, at events like this, quietly, efficiently, and with just enough venom to keep it interesting. People said she had worked for the Caldwell Group once, years ago, in some capacity no one could quite recall. People said she had been let go, under circumstances that were never made entirely clear. People said she had tried to pursue some kind of legal action, and failed, and that this was the kind of grudge that curdled over time into something dangerous. No one knew her name when they said these things. No one needed to. The story itself was the point, a cautionary shape, a reason to watch her from the corner of an eye. Ethan Caldwell stood near the center of the room, with the ease of a man who had long ago made peace with not seeing. He was 52 years old, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, wearing a charcoal suit that had clearly been made for him and no one else. He had lost his sight in his late 20s, under circumstances that were never discussed in the profiles journalists wrote about him, and he had rebuilt everything afterward with a methodical, almost frightening discipline. The Caldwell Group now held interests in real estate, infrastructure, and private equity across 11 states. He was known for a handshake that lasted exactly the right amount of time, and a memory for voices that bordered on the supernatural. People said he could identify a person from their footsteps alone. People who worked for him said he never forgot anything, not a name, not a promise, not an error. He navigated the ballroom that night with a slight tilt of his head, tracking the shifting architecture of conversation around him, his cane touching the floor in a rhythm so natural it seemed almost decorative. Beside him, Vanessa Caldwell was 38 and luminous in the specific way that results from a great deal of money applied carefully and consistently over a long period of time. Her gown was ivory and structured, her jewelry tasteful and significant. She had been photographed for 3 national magazine covers in the past 2 years, always framed as the capable, compassionate force behind her husband's foundation, the woman who gave the Caldwell wealth its human face. She laughed at the right moments. She remembered the names of board members' children. She had mastered the performance of warmth so completely that most people who encountered it would have bet their own money it was real. From her position near the edge of the room, Naomi Reeves watched Vanessa Caldwell with an expression that had nothing in it resembling admiration. It was the expression of a person watching a piece of theater, performed by someone who had stolen the script. The gala moved through its formal sequence cocktails, Dinner, a string quartet playing something tastefully European, and then the moment everyone had technically come for, the fun drive. Vanessa ascended to the stage with the smooth certainty of a woman who had rehearsed this exact approach many times, and the room settled into the particular attentive quiet of people who are about to be asked for money and have already decided to give it. She spoke about children in underserved communities. She spoke about access to education as the fundamental right it theoretically was. She spoke with the rhythm of someone who had spent many hours in front of mirrors and speech coaches, and the crowd responded with nods and then with applause, and then with the specific kind of emotional warmth that expensive charity events are designed to produce. Naomi set down her glass of water. She stood up from her chair, and in a voice that carried with absolute precision across the entire room, she said, "Everything she just told you is a lie." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of 400 people simultaneously recalibrating. Vanessa stopped speaking. Her hands remained at her sides. On the near side of the room, a woman in diamonds pressed her fingers to her lips. A man in a senator's cut suit turned slowly toward the sound. Waitstaff froze mid-stride. Ethan Caldwell, whose face had been an expression of quiet pride 2 seconds earlier, turned his head toward the source of the voice with a precision that suggested he had already begun to catalog it. Naomi did not sit back down. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and her chin level, and she waited for the room to understand that she was not finished. The murmurs began a low rolling tide of discomfort, disapproval, the collective social immune response of a room full of people who understood that a disruption of this nature threatened not just the evening, but the entire elegant fiction that made evenings like this possible. Someone near the back laughed the involuntary, nervous kind. Several people looked at Ethan. Ethan's jaw had tightened. He handed his cane to an aide without looking and took 2 deliberate steps toward the sound of her voice, and his posture as he moved was not the posture of a man asking questions. It was the posture of a man who had already decided the answer. "She doesn't belong here," he said, not loudly, but with the kind of authority that carries in large rooms. "Whatever grievance she believes she has, this is not the place, and this is not the time." He turned his face toward where Vanessa stood on the stage. "Are you all right?" The question was gentle and certain, the voice of a man protecting something precious. Vanessa descended the stage steps slowly, touching Ethan's arm when she reached him, and her expression was a finely calibrated performance of dignity, under assault, the wronged woman who refuses to lower herself. Naomi watched this and felt something shift inside her. Not rage, not grief, something older and colder than either. She raised her voice again and said, "She stole someone's identity. This marriage was built on a lie she has been telling for 25 years. The room tightened. Ethan's expression changed, not cracking, but reconfiguring, a subtle rearrangement of the features of a man who is hearing something he is choosing not to believe. He spoke to someone beside him, and then 2 security staff began moving toward Naomi from opposite sides of the room, not hurrying, professional and purposeful. She did not step back. She looked directly at Ethan, not at the security men, not at the room, and she said, clearly enough to be heard without shouting, "You have no idea who you're living with." The security men reached her. Ethan raised one hand toward them, and they stopped. He walked the remaining distance to where she stood himself, stopping close enough that she could see the texture of the scar tissue at the outer corner of his left eye. His right hand came up, and he struck her, open palm, across the left side of her face. Not hard enough to knock her sideways, but hard enough that the sound of it, that flat, terrible percussion, crossed the entire room in an instant, and arrived in 400 ears simultaneously, and was absorbed in 400 different ways, all of them involving some version of horror. Nobody spoke. The chandeliers continued their indifferent brilliance overhead. Naomi's face turned with the impact and then turned back. She pressed 2 fingers briefly to her cheekbone and then lowered her hand. She looked at Ethan for a long moment, and then she stepped forward, so close that she could have been speaking to him alone in an empty room, and she put her mouth near his ear. She said 3 words, "New Orleans, 1998. She stepped back. What happened to Ethan Caldwell's face in the seconds that followed was not something that could be easily described to someone who had not seen it. The color left it. The architecture of his expression, that structure built from decades of discipline and control, came apart in stages, like a building that takes a moment to understand it has been struck. His mouth opened. His breath came differently. He put one hand out, not searching for support, but in the gesture of a man trying to steady himself against something invisible. From across the room, Vanessa watched his face change. And something changed in hers too, a small, specific contraction around the eyes. The involuntary recognition of a person who knows exactly what those words mean and has spent a long time being certain they would never be spoken in her presence again. She stepped forward. "Ethan," she said. Her voice had changed. Ethan did not turn toward her. He stood with his hand still extended and said, quietly, "Who are you?" Naomi said, "The person your wife thought she'd buried for good." Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he asked everyone to leave the room. The staff left first, with the practiced efficiency of people trained to disappear. The guests followed some quickly, most slowly, with the reluctance of witnesses who understood that what they were leaving behind would be discussed for years. Within 7 minutes, the Meridian Ballroom held only 3 people: Ethan Caldwell, Vanessa Caldwell, and a woman they had not introduced themselves to, standing in the ruins of the evening's careful architecture, surrounded by the evidence of a party still in progress. Half-full glasses, untouched dessert plates, a string quartet that had packed its instruments and gone without being asked. Naomi sat down in one of the gold ballroom chairs as though she had been standing for a very long time. She had. 25 years is a very long time to stand. In the winter of 1998, Ethan Caldwell was 27 years old and had not yet lost anything. He was building the first version of what would later become the Caldwell Group from a rented office in the warehouse district of New Orleans, running on ambition and an almost religious belief in his own capacity for work. He had 3 employees and a business model that existed somewhere between bold and reckless. And what saved the company in its earliest and most precarious stage was not his talent for negotiation or his tolerance for risk. It was Naomi Reeves, who had come to him through a mutual acquaintance with a mind for structural finance that most people in the industry, in that era, would not have expected from someone who looked like her. She did not ask to be named. She asked to be paid fairly and to do the work. Ethan had agreed to both, without hesitation, which was how she knew he was different from the others. They had worked together for 14 months. In that time, she had restructured his company's debt 3 times, sourced a significant equity partner he had failed to find in 2 years of trying, and identified a regulatory vulnerability in a competing firm that ultimately cleared the path for Caldwell's first major acquisition. She had also, in the way that proximity and shared pressure sometimes produces, become the person Ethan trusted most in the world, and for a period of about 6 months, something more than that, though neither of them named it clearly. Vanessa Hartley was there in the same period, working as an administrative assistant, quiet and observant, always in the room but rarely at the center of it. Naomi had noticed the way Vanessa watched her. At the time, she had thought it was admiration. The fire started on a Thursday night in November. Naomi was working late in the office alone. She often worked late, and she often worked alone, and she had long since stopped thinking of either of these things as unusual. She smelled the smoke before she heard anything, and then the hallway outside the office door was filling with it. She got to Ethan's office, where he had fallen asleep at his desk again, pulled him physically from the building through a back stairwell, while the front of the structure became completely impassable. She sustained burns to her right forearm and her left hand. She lost hearing in her left ear for 3 weeks. Ethan, disoriented and half-conscious when she reached him, took in a quantity of smoke that the attending doctors later said was responsible for the damage to his optic nerves, damage that would become total blindness within 6 months. Neither of them had understood that yet in those first hours. In those first hours, there was only the cold outside the building and the distant sound of sirens and Ethan's hand in hers. When Ethan woke in the hospital, Vanessa was there. Naomi was not. Naomi had been taken to a different facility, and then, before she was discharged, a lawyer representing the Caldwell Group had appeared with documents alleging that she had removed proprietary financial files from the office and that her presence was no longer welcome at the company. The documents had been prepared, she would later learn, while she was still in surgery. She had no money for a counterclaim. She had no one with access to Ethan. By the time she understood fully what had happened, Vanessa had already told Ethan a different story, that Naomi had started the fire accidentally, through negligence, and had fled rather than face accountability. That the rescue, such as it was, had been Vanessa's doing. Ethan, newly blind, newly dependent, newly isolated from the world he had known, had believed the version of events that the person beside him delivered. He had no reason to doubt it. He had no way to check. Naomi had spent 2 years trying to reach him through letters that went unanswered, through lawyers who informed her their client had no interest in further contact, through a mutual acquaintance who reported back that Ethan had described her as a person he did not wish to discuss. After that, she had rebuilt her life from a different city, in a different industry, with the specific and painful thoroughness of a person who has decided that the only survivable option is to begin entirely from the beginning. She had done well. She had done better than well. She had not done it without cost. She carried the cost in the way people carry things that have no external form, not visibly, but always. In the empty ballroom, under the dying brilliance of the chandeliers, Naomi opened the bag she had carried all evening. She removed a folder. Inside it were documents that had taken her the better part of 3 years to assemble hospital records from the night of the fire, including the emergency intake report that noted 2 casualties from the same building, both treated for smoke inhalation and burn injuries, at 2 separate hospitals. There were photographs taken by a journalist who had covered the fire for a local paper, showing the exterior of the building and, in one image, a woman supporting an unconscious man through a side exit. The woman's face was turned away from the camera. Her right arm was burned to the elbow. There were financial records, obtained through a forensic accounting firm, showing a series of wire transfers from a Caldwell Group account to an account in Vanessa's mother's name, beginning 9 days after the fire and continuing for 4 years. There was a notarized statement from a former Caldwell Group attorney who had since retired and decided, at 71, that he had held this particular secret for long enough. Vanessa looked at the documents. Then she looked at Naomi. Then she said, "You don't have proof of anything that matters." Her voice had lost its ballroom texture. It was flatter now, more careful, the voice of someone running a calculation. Ethan had turned his face toward the folder without seeing it, tracking the sounds, the soft percussive report of each page being placed on the table, the quality of the silence that followed. "You have photographs of a woman with her face turned," Vanessa continued. "You have bank records that could have 100 explanations. You have a statement from a man who is senile and has an axe to grind. This is nothing." Naomi said, "Then why are your hands shaking?" Vanessa looked at her hands. She pressed them flat against her thighs. Ethan said quietly, "Vanessa, not a question, not a command. Something between them, an opening into which he was waiting for her to say something true. She did not. She took a breath and arranged her expression back into suffering and said, "Ethan, you know what I went through to be here for you. You know what I sacrificed. This woman has spent years building a case against us out of bitterness and jealousy." And Ethan said, "Stop." She stopped. The room was very quiet. He said, "In the hospital, the night of the fire, you told me you carried me out." Vanessa said, "Yes." He said, "You described the back stairwell, the angle of the exit." Vanessa said, "Yes, I." He said, "You described your hands on my arms, my weight against you." She said nothing. He said, "You have told me that story many times, in exactly the same way each time." A long pause. A person who was actually there would not tell a story the same way each time. Something broke in the room then, not dramatically, not with noise, but in the way that a thing breaks when the last structural element holding it up finally gives. A former Caldwell employee named Gregory Marsh, who had been persuaded to attend the gala at Naomi's specific request for reasons he had agreed to without fully understanding, stepped through the service entrance at the back of the room. He was 64 years old, and he walked with a cane, and he had spent the last 18 months of his employment at the Caldwell Group, knowing something he should not have known and saying nothing about it, and he had not slept well in the 18 months since he had left. He confirmed what the documents suggested. He confirmed the transfers. He confirmed the name on the account. He confirmed that he had been present when Vanessa had given instructions that a certain former consultant's attempts to contact Mr. Caldwell were to be intercepted and disposed of without response. He said all of this in the measured, specific language of a man who has rehearsed his conscience. Vanessa's performance of the wronged woman lasted approximately 40 more seconds. Then it collapsed. What replaced it was not grief and not remorse. It was something Naomi had expected to see and had steeled herself against. Fury. Pure, unmediated, self-preserving fury. Vanessa stood up from her chair, and she said that none of this was what it seemed. That she had protected Ethan, that she had given up her own life for him, that everything she had done because she loved him and understood what he needed, in a way no one else did, and certainly not this woman who had walked away when things became difficult. Naomi said, quietly, "I did not walk away." Vanessa turned on her. "You were gone. You disappeared. I was the one who stayed." Naomi said, "I was in a hospital with burns on my arms and a lawyer at my door telling me I was fired." The two women looked at each other. Ethan sat between them and said nothing for a very long time. He asked his remaining aide for his phone. He made a call and asked a question and listened to the response. The response lasted about 90 seconds. When he ended the call, he was still. Naomi watched his face and felt, for the first time in years, something she had not expected to feel in this room. A reluctant, careful sorrow for him. He had not known. She had spent 25 years believing, on some level, that he must have known that the alternative, the idea that he had simply been deceived completely, required believing in a kind of helplessness that seemed incompatible with the man she had known. But watching him now, she understood that blindness is not only the loss of physical sight. She had known this in the abstract. She understood it differently now. Vanessa left, not with dignity, with desperation, which wears dignity's shoes but moves nothing like it. She went first to the private room where her coat and her larger bag were kept, and she took what was in the bag: certain documents, certain drives, the assembled materials of a person who has always kept a version of an exit plan, and she went to the parking structure adjacent to the hotel. Outside, the rain was heavy and indiscriminate, and the city's lights dissolved in it like watercolors. She had a car waiting. The documents she needed were in the car. She reached the vehicle and opened the rear door and was reaching inside when she heard footsteps behind her and looked up and found, against all expectation, that she was not alone. Ethan had come through the hotel's street-level exit with Gregory Marsh beside him and two security personnel, and Naomi 3 steps behind all of them, and the rain was immediate and cold, and none of them seemed to register it. Vanessa straightened. She looked at the assembled group, and she looked at the phone in the hand of one of the security men, the screen lit and the recording application open, and she understood that the last move was gone. People make confessions in the rain when they believe there is nothing left to lose, or when, in the complex calculus of a person who has been performing for so long, the exhaustion of performance becomes indistinguishable from a kind of relief. Vanessa Caldwell said things in that parking structure that she had not said to anyone in 25 years. She said them in fragments and in anger, and in the particular incoherence of someone who has run out of the energy required to maintain a version of events. She said enough. The phone recorded all of it. It was one of the security men who called the police, without being asked to, because there are some confessions that move through a person like electricity and leave no room for hesitation. The squad car arrived in 9 minutes. Vanessa did not go quietly, but she went. By the time the news reached the first overnight desk, 3 sources had already filed reports, and the video from the parking structure, taken not only by the security man but also by a hotel valet who had witnessed the final exchange from 20 feet away, had already begun its rapid passage through the communication networks of a city that had loved Vanessa Caldwell's story and would now, with equal appetite, consume its ending. The morning edition carried the story on its front page. The headline described a charity gala. The photograph showed the Meridian Grand in the rain. In the days that followed, the Caldwell Group's board of directors met in emergency session and then met again, and then issued a statement that said a great deal in the careful, legally reviewed language of institutional crisis management and revealed very little. Ethan issued a statement of his own, separately, without the board's input, and it said what it meant. It named Naomi Reeves. It described in terms that were personal and specific, and stripped of the usual protective vagueness of public statements, what she had done on a November night in New Orleans, and what had been done to her afterward, and the nature of his own failure to pursue the truth. The statement was published in full, in 7 outlets, and excerpted in dozens more, and discussed at a length that would have satisfied almost anyone who had spent 25 years waiting to be acknowledged. Naomi read it once. She did not read it again. She came to the hotel the following afternoon, at Ethan's request, not the Meridian, but a smaller place he kept rooms in when he was in the city on foundation business, a quiet building without chandeliers or marble floors. The room they met in had 2 chairs and a window, and the muted traffic sounds of an ordinary afternoon. Ethan was already there when she arrived. He did not stand when she entered. He sat with his hands in his lap and waited until he heard her sit before he spoke. He said, "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not going to ask for it. I'm going to say what's true, and then I'll leave it with you." He said that he had loved her in the way that a person loves something they do not yet understand they are capable of losing. He said that after the fire, in the hospital, in the long disorientation of those first months without sight, he had needed something to hold on to, and Vanessa had positioned herself as that thing, and he had held on without asking the questions that a less frightened man would have asked. He said that this was not an excuse. He said the difference between an explanation and an excuse was that one of them required the person speaking to remain accountable for the result. He intended to remain accountable for the result. Naomi sat with this for a while. The window showed a rectangle of gray sky. She said, "The hardest part was not what Vanessa did. I understood what Vanessa did. She saw something she wanted, and she took it. And she was careful about it. I understood that." She paused. "What I couldn't understand for a long time was why you never looked. You had resources. You had people. You could have asked questions. You chose not to." Ethan said. "Yes." She said, "I needed to know if that was because you believed her or because on some level you didn't want to know." He was quiet. Then he said, "Both, at different times." She nodded, though he could not see it. She said, "That's honest." He said, "It's the least I can offer." She said, "It's not nothing." He asked if there was anything financial restitution, public acknowledgement, legal action on her behalf that his team could support, any form of reparation that she would accept. She said she would think about the legal question. She said the financial question was complicated in ways that had more to do with her own sense of herself than with the actual money. She said that what she wanted most was something he could not give her, which was the years. She was 50 years old, and she had spent the most productive decade of her professional life rebuilding from a position she should never have been pushed out of, and no amount of money or public acknowledgement changed the arithmetic of that. He said, "I know." She said, "Then we understand each other." She stood. She picked up her coat from the arm of the chair. She said, without looking at him, "I don't hate you, Ethan. I thought I would. I came to that ballroom planning to." He turned his face toward her voice. She said, "But you were a victim too, just a different kind." She left the room. He sat in the chair and listened to the sound of the door closing and the silence that followed it. She left the city on a Tuesday, early, before the morning traffic built. She had a car taking her to the airport. She had a flight to a city where she had work she had neglected for a week, and a team that had been patient about her absence, and an apartment that looked out over water that moved constantly and never asked anything of her. She did not look at the Meridian Grand as she passed it on the way out of the downtown corridor. She looked forward, at the gray pre-dawn road and the first pale fractioning of light at the edge of the sky, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of luxury. The luxury of a person who has finally put something down after carrying it for a very long time. In the Caldwell Group's flagship building, in the penthouse office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over a city that was rearranging its understanding of him, Ethan Caldwell sat at his desk and held in his hands a photograph that had been among the materials Naomi had left behind. A photograph from New Orleans, sometime in the spring of 1998. Taken at the office when the Caldwell Group had 3 employees and a rented floor of an old brick building, and the particular quality of light that comes into warehouse district offices in early April. He was in it. She was in it. They were both young in ways that he had not thought of himself as young at the time. His hands on the photograph were steady for a moment. Then they were not. He set the photograph carefully on the desk in front of him, in a position where he would have been able to see it, if he could see. He kept his hands on its surface for a long time, as though stillness alone were a form of apology or a form of attention, which is sometimes the same thing and is always better than its absence. There are people who lose their sight and spend the rest of their lives navigating by the light they remember. And there are people who can see perfectly, with no physical deficiency of any kind, who move through entire decades without seeing a single true thing about the world they live in, about the people beside them, about the nature of the love they believe they're receiving, about the cost being paid, in some other room, by someone they have chosen not to look for. The chandeliers of the Meridian Grand were turned off by 7 in the morning. The marble floors were cleaned. The floral arrangements were removed and redistributed to hospitals and hospice facilities in the surrounding neighborhoods, where they opened in rooms full of people who had not been to a gala and would not go to one, and who were glad, in the uncomplicated way of people near the end of things, for something that still smelled like the living world. Naomi's plane lifted from the runway. As the sun came fully over the horizon, she watched the city fall away beneath her, its towers and bridges, and the river moving through it, and the neighborhoods around the river, where she had once been young and certain, and had not yet learned the particular lesson that life was preparing to teach her. She did not feel that lesson as a sorrow, exactly, from this altitude. She felt it as a fact. One of the most important facts about human beings is that they are capable of surviving the things that are done to them, and that survival, though it is not the same as flourishing, is not nothing. And that flourishing, when it comes after all of it, is something that belongs entirely, and without qualification, to the person who achieves it. No one can take it from you once you have it. No one can tell a different version of it. It is simply and permanently yours. The plane moved through the clouds, and the city disappeared, and Naomi Reeves leaned back against the headrest and closed her eyes, and felt, for the first time, in a very long time, the uncomplicated and underrated sensation of being done. The scandal metastasized through the city's social body, the way these things always do, faster than truth and slower than justice. By the second morning, 3 of the Caldwell Foundation's major institutional donors had requested meetings that were clearly not about philanthropy. By the third, a former Caldwell Group vice president named Sandra Hewitt, who had left the firm 7 years earlier, under circumstances she had described at the time only as philosophical differences, gave an interview to a financial publication in which she confirmed that she had, during her tenure, been asked on 2 separate occasions to alter records related to the company's early operational history. She had declined both times. She had not reported this because, she said, she had not fully understood what she was being asked to conceal, and because she had not wanted to believe it was as serious as it seemed. The interviewer asked her if she believed it now. She said she was afraid she did. Ethan's legal team moved with the speed of people who understand that inaction in a crisis is itself a form of action, and always the wrong kind. 3 civil actions were filed on his behalf against Vanessa within the first week: fraud, embezzlement, and a third more complex claim related to the deliberate obstruction of the original investigation into the 1998 fire, which the New Orleans Fire Marshal's office had apparently closed without conclusion, and which a request for review had now been submitted to reopen. Vanessa's own attorney, a man with a reputation for rescuing situations that looked unsalvageable, met with the evidence in private and told his client, in terms that were not unkind but were entirely precise, that his job was now to minimize rather than to defend. Vanessa had sat across the table from him in the conference room of the city's most expensive criminal defense firm and looked at him with the expression of a person who is beginning to understand the dimensions of the room they are trapped in. She had said, "There has to be something." Her attorney had said, "There isn't." She had not spoken again for 4 minutes, which he noted, because in 15 years of practice, he had never seen a client take bad news that quietly. The social registry of the city's upper stratum, which had embraced Vanessa Caldwell with a warmth that was partly genuine and partly the reflexive affection of wealth, for beauty that aligns itself with wealth, performed its withdrawal with the same efficiency it applied to everything else. Invitations stopped. The weekly lunch with 2 women she had considered close friends was rescheduled once and then simply never rescheduled again. A charitable board on which she had served as vice chair accepted her resignation with a brief acknowledgement, and moved on. This is the particular cruelty of social elevation achieved through performance. The performance, once exposed, takes everything with it that the performance had built. Vanessa had understood this risk abstractly. She had not understood it viscerally until she was inside it. Naomi received 17 media requests in the 48 hours following the parking structure video's circulation. She declined all of them through a single brief statement issued by a publicist she hired for the purpose, which said that she was gratified that the truth had been established and that she had no further comment. She meant both parts of this. She understood that the press appetite for her story was not interest in her as a person. It was interest in the narrative shape of what had happened to her, which was pleasing and legible and confirmed something people wanted to believe about the world. She had been wronged. She had persisted. The wrong had been corrected. This was a story with clean lines, and clean lines are always in demand. The actual Naomi Reeves, the one who had spent years in a city nobody wrote about, rebuilding a career in ways that were incremental and unglamorous, and occasionally humiliating, who had been angry for so long that the anger had eventually become structural, a load-bearing wall she had built her rebuilt life against that person, was not the person the press was calling about. She did not begrudge them their version. She simply did not intend to participate in it. What she did do, quietly and without announcement, was accept a meeting with the legal team Ethan had offered her access to. She sat with 2 attorneys for 3 hours and went through everything she had assembled and everything they brought to the table. And at the end of the meeting, she had a clear picture of what was possible and what was not. Financial restitution was possible, a substantial portion of it, through the civil claims. The legal mechanism for addressing what had been done to her professionally in 1998 was more complex, given the time elapsed, but not entirely without avenues. She told the attorneys she would think about it and get back to them. And she did think about it, for several days, in the mornings before work, when she habitually sat with her coffee by the window that looked out over the water, and what she concluded was that she wanted the restitution, not because she needed the money she had built enough, over enough years, that she did not need it, but because she was owed it, and because being owed something and not collecting it is its own kind of diminishment. She instructed the attorneys to proceed. The board meeting at which Ethan faced formal questions about his fitness to continue, as chairman of the Caldwell Group's foundation, was private, but the aftermath was not. He retained his position by a margin that 2 board members described, separately, as narrower than it appeared, and the conditions attached to the vote involved a level of oversight and governance restructuring that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Ethan accepted all of it without objection. He was present at the meeting in the way that a person is present when they have stopped defending a particular position, fully, clearly, and without the ambient distraction of self-protection. A board member who had known him for 11 years and would later describe the meeting privately noted that he seemed, paradoxically, more himself than he had been in years. As though the collapse of a certain version of things had made room for something more accurate to occupy the space. He arranged for a formal public acknowledgement, not a press conference, which would have felt too staged, but an open letter published in full, in 3 major outlets, addressed not to the public or to the board, but to Naomi directly, and made available publicly because the wrong had been public, and the acknowledgement needed to match it in scale. It laid out what had happened in New Orleans in 1998 with a specificity and a clarity of moral accounting that was unusual in public statements by people of his wealth and standing. It did not explain. It did not contextualize. It said what had been done and who had done it and what had been lost as a result, and at the end of it, it said that he did not expect forgiveness, but that the record required correction and that correcting it was the first obligation and not the last. Naomi read it on her phone while she was waiting for a meeting to begin. She read it twice. She put the phone face down on the conference table and sat quietly for a moment before the other people in the room arrived. And what she felt was not triumph, and not resolution, and not grief. Exactly. It was something more like the sensation of a door closing on a room. You have not been inside for a very long time, a room that has been part of the architecture of your life, for so long that you had stopped noticing it was there. And closing the door changes the air in the entire house. The settlement negotiation concluded in just under 3 months. Naomi's attorneys were experienced, and the Caldwell Group's attorneys were cooperative, in ways that settlements are rarely cooperative, which shortened the process considerably. The terms were not publicly disclosed. Naomi had insisted on this not to protect anyone, but because she believed that the private dimension of what had happened to her deserved to remain private once it had been publicly acknowledged. And because she did not want the number to become the story. The number was significant. She acknowledged this to herself without sentiment. She set aside a portion of it, a specific and deliberate amount, to fund a fellowship program for women of color in financial services, administered through an independent foundation with no connection to the Caldwell name. She had been thinking about this for years and had not had the resources to do it. She named it after no one. She did not want it to be named after anyone. Ethan's blindness, which had defined the public understanding of him for more than 2 decades, acquired a different dimension in the stories that were written about him in the months following the gala. People who had always described his blindness as something he had overcome now wrote about the other kind, the trusting blindness, the chosen blindness, the blindness that is not a medical condition but a form of love turned dangerous by the absence of scrutiny. He did not find these pieces particularly useful. He did not find them inaccurate. He had always been more interested in what was true than in what was comfortable. And what was true was that he had built a world around a person without ever doing the work of knowing her, and that the world had been partly beautiful and partly a lie, and that he had benefited from both parts without asking which was which. He thought about this with the methodical precision he applied to everything else. He did not arrive at a satisfying conclusion. He was not sure satisfying conclusions were available for this category of problem. He kept the photograph on his desk. He could not see it. He did not need to. There is a particular quality of silence in a large room when most of the lights have been turned off and most of the people have gone home, and the room holds only the evidence of what it recently was, the ghost architecture of a closed architecture. Party. The rearranged furniture, the faint residue of perfume and wine, and the specific human warmth that a large gathering generates and that dissipates so quickly after the gathering ends. The Meridian Grand's ballroom held that quality on the night of the charity gala, after the police left and the last of the guests had been interviewed and the staff had been released, and the marble floors were cleaned and the chandeliers dimmed to their overnight setting. The shattered glass from Ethan's fall had been swept up within minutes of falling by a man in white gloves who had appeared from somewhere and disappeared again without making a sound, because that is what the staff of places like the Meridian Grand are trained to do, to restore the appearance of order so efficiently that disorder itself seems briefly to have been a hallucination. But disorder had been real that night. The truth had been real. Naomi Reeves had stood in that room and spoken true things into a space designed to insulate people from true things, and the space had not been able to contain it. She carried nothing from the city when she left except what she had brought, and one thing she had not expected: the knowledge that the version of herself she had preserved through 25 years of fury and discipline, the self that had remained certain about what had happened and why, and what it meant, was now free to become something else. She did not know yet what something else looked like. She suspected it would take time. She had given enough of her time to the past that she felt no particular impatience about the future. The plane moved through the morning sky. The water below caught the early light and scattered it. She watched it until the clouds closed over it, and then she opened the book she had brought and began to read. And outside the window, the world continued its ordinary turning, which requires nothing of any of us and offers everything, and which is the same for everyone regardless of what they have endured or survived or learned too late or finally, after everything, managed to put down. Some things are seen only after they are lost. Some people are known only after they are gone. And some truths wait with a patience that outlasts every effort made to bury them, because the truth does not need anyone's help. It only needs time. Ethan Caldwell sat alone in his office for a long time after the settlement was signed, after the board meetings concluded, after the legal teams filed their final paperwork, and the press moved on to the next story. He sat at his desk with the photograph and with the particular silence of a man who has arrived at a destination he was not expecting to reach. He had built a great deal in his life. He had lost a great deal in his life. And much of what he had believed he was building had turned out, in the light of what he now knew, to be something different from what he had intended: a structure whose foundations had been laid in someone else's suffering, without his knowledge, but also without his inquiry. The distinction between those two things was real, and it mattered. And it was also, when you sat with it honestly, smaller than he would have liked it to be. He was a man who had not asked enough questions. He was a man who had chosen comfort over truth at a moment when the cost of that choice was borne by someone else entirely. He intended to spend the remainder of whatever time he had being a man who did not make that choice again. It was not a form of redemption. It was a form of accountability, which is quieter and more durable, and, in the end, more honest than redemption has ever managed to be.